This week on the Wheelhouse, the T in LGBTQ+, President Trump's rejection of trans identity, and reaction from the community. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond, right here. On President Donald Trump's first day in office, he signed an executive order stating that the government would recognize only two sexes, male and female. From passports to health care, as a result, federal agencies have already begun rolling back the acknowledgement of trans Americans, but not without obstacles in their way. Legal challenges still pending threaten President Trump's ability to take away trans rights. So what does all of this mean for trans residents of Connecticut? Joining me now is Ricardo Martinez, Executive Director of GLAAD Law. Mr. Martinez, great to have you on the show.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Folks out there, if you have any questions about your access to gender-affirming care or a passport with the correct gender marker, give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Ricardo, I want to start off with this. GLAAD Law has been litigating cases involving discriminatory practices towards trans people for decades, not just now, obviously. Is there anything that sets the work you're doing today apart from previous years?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to mind is just this moment, right? The moment is different. The type of coordinated, cruel, and relentless attack on transgender people that we're up against, and the effort and resources that are being put into preventing transgender people from navigating and functioning in society safely at this time is just different than our work in the past. And because it's such an urgent moment, having early wins is essential, right? I think our strategy has been surging in litigation and really meeting the moment head on. And as I mentioned, just having those early wins gives us time to build stronger protections and helps Americans understand what's really at stake, because this isn't just about transgender people's rights. It's about whether or not this nation will be governed by law rather than a nation that's going to be led by those who think they're above it.
What legal challenges to Trump's orders are you involved in right now?
So GLAAD Law and the National Center for Lesbian Rights, SCLR, are challenging Trump's transgender military ban executive order. We're representing individuals who have enlisted, as well as active service members who have decades of experience across all branches, contributing amongst the highest level of service. We have two legal challenges there. We have in Moe v. Trump, Doe v. Bondi, and Jones v. Bondi. GLAAD Law and SCLR have filed 3 lawsuits challenging sections of the executive order that directs the Federal Bureau of Prisons to house transgender women in men's prisons and to unlawfully withhold necessary medical care, putting them in unnecessary and imminent risk. And the last challenge, GLAAD Law and the ACLU of New Hampshire are defending Parker and Iris, 2 transgender high schoolers, challenging the ban that aims to keep them and other trans girls from playing sports with their friends.
I appreciate the fact that you brought that up, because that's been something that's outstanding in Connecticut in recent years. And GLAAD has been defending 2 students in particular against several students, and a national effort led by, I forget off the top of my head right now. I'm kind of sputtering. I apologize. But it was Andrea Yearwood was the student athlete here in Connecticut. Terry Miller, another student athlete here in Connecticut. But essentially, it was the Alliance Defending Freedom that was challenging their right, and others, a law that stands here in Connecticut that allows athletes to participate in sports to the gender to which they identify with. And that's the work that you all have been doing.
For sure. Prior to my work at GLAAD Law, I worked for the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network back in 2010. So Connecticut isn't new, and this issue isn't new, right? We were having nuanced conversations with parents, with school administrators, teachers, and the young people themselves back in 2010, 2012 about how do we allow everyone to feel a sense of school belonging without alienating folks and what is best for school communities, right? And I think at the time they were finding solutions that worked, and now we're in a place where exclusion is what's being championed on hyperlocal context, and people aren't necessarily having conversations that really honor what we have all committed to, right? Which is ensuring that kids can learn, can go to school, and focus on the things that are most important.
Thank you so much for that perspective. Earlier, I believe you said litigation surge. What does that mean? Basically, getting ahead of things and challenging earlier rather than later, early wins, trying to get some early wins?
Yeah, I think early wins are important for a lot of reasons. The first one being hope, right? I think we're in this moment where it feels like an extraordinary moment in history where things are moving so quickly. People are kind of shocked and amazed about just the cruelty, the language that's being used. And a surge in litigation not only meets the moment, meaning there are people in imminent danger as a result of these executive orders, and we need to move as quickly as possible to ensure that we are delaying that harm from actually occurring. Although we know that just the rollout of those executive orders causes harm at a local context for people who are just trying to navigate life.
What harms are you seeing? You mentioned those harms. What are you seeing? How are people doing?
Yeah. Look, our free legal helpline, Glad Law Answers, has responded to over nearly 2,000 inquiries this year since January 20th. That helpline helps our entire community, but since January, we've gotten calls disproportionately from transgender people who need help navigating urgent legal questions on family protections, healthcare access, school rights, identity document changes, and online safety. And additionally, requests for assistance through our transgender identification project, which provides step-by-step guidance on updating gender markers and other documents, have tripled. But personally, I have participated in a lot of panels and a lot of local events, and I've had many chances to chat with community members who, before these attacks, were already struggling with finding affordable housing or finding and keeping employment or accessing necessary and affordable healthcare. That this dangerous misinformation campaign has negatively contributed to that experience in terms of heightening the experience of discrimination as they navigate life, and their own sense of safety and security.
Is Connecticut still considered a safe place for trans people? What about other neighboring states in New England? And how does this kind of jive with federal law?
So that's a good question. So regardless of where trans members of our community live, they are all worried about their personal safety, right? Even in states like Connecticut, where state law explicitly prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in areas like employment, housing, public accommodations, etc., the disinformation just has an impact on how people navigate their everyday life, right? And while the same is true for neighboring states like Massachusetts and Rhode Island, New Hampshire recently passed a sports ban last year that we are currently litigating and are currently moving forward with a bill aimed to take medical care away from trans adolescents.
I appreciate that you bring that up because that is an important designation that you may have laws in place, but still when there's rhetoric, when there's misinformation, when people are rejecting your identity, I imagine that's got to be hard for people. How much can Connecticut safeguard its residents against some of these executive orders? What can be done?
Yeah, I think to your point, I worked in Texas for about 5 years before I moved to Boston to do this work with Glad Law. And the disinformation, regardless of where you are, emboldens people who don't seek to understand you to cause you harm, to discriminate against you, to violate you, to intimidate you in public life. I think it's important to note that executive orders cannot directly override or change existing federal or state law, right? I think that's important. I think it's critically important that lawmakers actively work to ensure that existing protections are preserved at the state level. And it's also important to practice uncommon courage at this moment and continue to be vocal allies to the LGBTQ community. This is really not a time to shrink in our vocal support. I also think that everyone in Connecticut has a role in protecting democracy. we always suggest for people to get involved with state and local work, whether it's adopting an LGBTQ center or a statewide organization, including um, getting involved in school committees and school boards, showing up and making sure that these anti-LGBTQ measures are shown some fierce opposition.
Do you have any idea where these? You mentioned really quickly the ban in New Hampshire that was enacted, and you're challenging it. We have a challenge here in Connecticut. Where do these stand? Have they changed at least since the administration has come on board? The new administration,
That's a
or is
really
it
great
too
question.
early to decide where those are at?
I think it's too early to decide, which is why it's important for people to really move vocally in opposition of these measures, right? I think people forget, and I'll go back to Texas really quickly because I think this is important to note that back in 2023, there were 146 anti-LGBTQ bills filed in the state of Texas, and they had them in this landscape where there was limited institutional power, meaning there was no supportive governor or lieutenant governor. We didn't have a majority in the Senate or the House, and yet only 7 anti-LGBTQ bills ended up passing. And I say yet, even though those were incredibly harmful passages, the 139 of those did not pass. And the only reason why they didn't pass is because thousands of people kept showing up to the Capitol, right? And I think we need that type of opposition here to ensure that where we do have rights, they are protected.
Someone listening right now has been considering updating their documents, especially state level docs like driver's license, birth certificates. Would now be the time to do so?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we get it very often. I think if folks want to update their identity documents or secure a legal name change, there are resources available for folks in Connecticut. On our website, we have a resource that helps folks consider individual factors when deciding to proceed in updating those identity documents, right? And these decisions are personal and should be based on specific circumstances, needs, and the comfort level of the person who is considering them. There are a couple of folks who are focused or have legal helplines like Glad Law Answers. NCLR has a help desk, and the National LGBTQ Bar Association, Lambda Legal, ACLU, all have help desks that can kind of navigate this space.
Can you share that website link in case anybody would like to visit that link to Glad Law and access this interface?
Yeah, I mean, as soon as you go to gladlaw.org, you'll see it at the very top.
Is preparedness something you would encourage for trans people right now? So what does this look like? What are some of the other tangible ways trans people can begin to safeguard their rights?
I think preparedness is important, but for all people, right? It's complicated suggesting tangible ways that anyone can begin to prepare in this moment. But if I had to suggest some stuff, I'd probably focus on 3 things. Number one, I think we all need to identify people that we can turn to in case of emergency, right? We need to surround ourselves with people who uplift us and we can experience joy with, because it will help sustain us over time. And then I think the third thing would be just taking personal inventory of your current situation, right? Think about your healthcare access. Think about your family structure, your on-life safety, identity documents. Where do you see vulnerabilities, and how can you build a contingency plan, and what resources like Glad Law or NCLR or ACLU or Lambda can you turn to for support?
I'm glad that you brought up trans joy and joy in general. Let's table that for now with you, but I'm going to have that conversation later on. I appreciate you bringing that up because it is important to look at life in certain ways here. But we are on the brink of summer. It means travel, vacation. Do you have any advice for Connecticut's trans residents as they prepare for out-of-state trips?
Yeah, I think it goes back to that preparedness question that you just posed, right? I think we need to do our homework, and some of that homework involves evaluating the risks that we're in depending on where we choose to travel, right? I know that some folks are having trepidation about international travel, and I think that there are things that and measures that people can take to ensure that they have a plan in case they are stopped on their way back to the United States. I would be mindful, if you're traveling in the States, about what states you're traveling to and being just knowledgeable about the laws in those states. The Movement Advancement Project has a great resource that tracks the different LGBTQ-related laws and policies across the United States. So I would urge people to make sure that they know the states that they're traveling, what those laws are, know the organizations that are operating in those states, because it's likely that there's an LGBTQ center or a statewide advocacy organization that exists, whether it's small or large. It depends on the state, but make sure that you have people you can turn to in case of emergencies. And if at all possible, traveling in groups rather than alone is really helpful.
You mentioned measures that people could take if they travel internationally, and I think it's returning back to America at this point. Is that what you're talking about? Maybe traveling in groups? Can you just get into those measures a little bit, something more tangible there?
Yeah, organization that supports LGBTQ people, we are taking our own measures for our own personal safety, right? And some of those measures include ensuring that our phones are locked down, right? That they're not, that my biometrics are turned off, that that we're not sharing our passcode, that we're taking the proper precautions to ensure that our online safety is maintained. We're not traveling with laptops. I would say ensuring that, again, people know exactly your itinerary, when you're supposed to arrive, when you're departing, things like that, that will just prepare for worst case scenario.
And that's what this very much sounds like. This is an existential threat. This is a right now thing. This is something that's happening, something that you and people are having to take very serious, something we should all take serious. That's what you're making it sound like here.
Yeah, for sure. And at the same time, we hope that the worst doesn't happen, right? But I think we just need to be prepared, and we can't assume that we can't tell ourselves that the attacks on the rights or freedoms of other people that do not share our exact lived experience don't touch us directly, right? Because the distance from the brutality offers us no protection. And so whatever we can do to take steps to ensure that we remain protected are probably the right things to do, even if the worst case scenario doesn't ultimately pan out. We hope it doesn't.
You mentioned the Movement Advancement Project. I want you to get into, as we finish up this interview, some resources our listeners, or maybe they're being impacted, or somebody that they know being maybe unfairly discriminated against. Can you get into some of those resources and try to spell out where people can find these things as well?
Yeah, I wish I had come prepared with all the URLs.
You already got it, though. It looks like you got the movement. We know gladlaw.org. That's one, but that's maybe right. Not necessarily the URLs if you don't have them. But keep sharing places if you can. If you have anything that you think people should use. Underscored is a popular thing I like to say on the Wheelhouse, and maybe people drink when I use the word underscore because I use it too much.
I would say one resource that is similar to the Movement Advancement Project that is a resource to find statewide organizations is Equality Federation. So the Federation houses links and connections to all of the statewide organizations that are operating and are doing some of this advocacy work. They're definitely a place to go to. Organizations, like I mentioned before, the National Center for Lesbian Rights, GLAD Law, the ACLU Help Desk, the Lambda Legal Help Desk, LGBTQ Bar Association, all those things, as long as you do a Google search, they'll come up pretty quickly. Those are good organizations to turn to. In terms of Connecticut, there might be mutual aid funds, some local organizers, organizations doing this work, and they can be linked through the Equality Federation site, I'm sure.
This was a tremendously helpful conversation, and I understand that there's going to be a lot of resources that we're going to be able to spin out of the conversation that we just had out to our listeners here in Connecticut via our newsroom. Thank you so much. This is Ricardo Martinez, Executive Director of GLAD Law. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
Ricardo gave us a lot of info about resources. If you're interested in finding them, we link to them at our website, ctpublic.org/wheelhouse. Coming up, a proposed rule that could make healthcare costs go up for trans Americans. Are you worried about your health coverage? Join the conversation. 888-720-9677. 888-720-9677. Back with more on the Wheelhouse after these messages. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. President Trump and his administration are taking aim at trans Americans. And under a recent rule, health care could get more expensive for transgender people. Here to tell us more, the return of Orion Rumler, LGBTQ plus reporter from the 19th. Orion, thank you for coming on the show today. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Frankie.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
And Evan Urquhart, journalist and founder of Assign Media. Evan, great to have you here. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
It's great to be here.
It's Evan Urquhart, right? Did I pronounce it wrong the first time? I apologize for that, Evan.
Evan Urquhart, no worries.
There you go. You can join the conversation. 888-720-9677. 888-720-9677. Evan, the push by Republican state lawmakers primarily to stop transgender adults and minors from being legally recognized in public life isn't new, but are there new tactics being used now? Is this a different kind of attack here?
It certainly is, or at least it's an escalation continuing to push the borders of the Constitution, of, sort of the tradition in America of live and let live. And so we're seeing some specifics, such as Trump executive order, attempting to ban or restrict gender-affirming care for youth nationwide, that defines a child as anyone under 19. So you would normally think of under 18. And so that's sort of pushing the boundaries of whether they can just sort of at will change what the definition of a child is. We've got, both states and the federal government targeting doctors and hospitals providing evidence-based healthcare. There are threats of, prosecution. There are threats of withdrawing funding. But we've also got this kind of broader umbrella that falls under maybe eliminating legal recognition for trans people. And this is things like defining woman and man in such a way that transgender people would sort of be defined out of existence. There's, throwing around words like fraud to describe living as a transgender person as fraudulent, and sort of an overall attempt to sort of erase transgender people as a type of person and to substitute this idea of us being, pushing a dangerous ideology that's harming the country.
I know that's not new. And that's important to highlight because, and we'll try to do this quickly here, but I think what we're essentially trying to ask you in the question before is, you've always had people like the ADF, for example, the Alliance Defending Freedom, when they're writing laws, they've been using the kind of words that we're seeing now indoctrinated into federal law. And that seems to be the change, where we're seeing some of this rhetoric that we've had in the past that Orion and I have been talking about over the last couple of years, that is now seeping its way into U.S. federal law. And even that executive order that we saw on day one of the Trump administration, is that kind of what's new? And what rhetoric is maybe taking hold and at least finding some success, at least in terms of the law, and maybe spreading misinformation?
Yeah, I mean, the law is a shifting target, and I think everyone is sort of scrambling to provide accurate information that's up to date. The judiciary has never been more politicized. And, the constitutional protections that we think we have, such as free expression, free association, it isn't clear, whether they'll hold. So the innovation is to sort of attack those constitutional protections and individual rights on a federal level in a way that we haven't seen before, and that it's not clear, how much of this the judiciary is going to allow.
What are you hearing from folks in the trans community? Are there any anecdotes that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so the trans community has been pretty worried for a pretty long time. And I think that it's it's very common for people to be having discussions about, can I leave my state? Can I leave the country? When would I have to leave the country? What is the moment that I would need to, consider that it's no longer safe to be a trans person, either in, a red state or in the country at large? But, I think the most vulnerable people are these families who have trans youth who have sought healthcare for them, who are afraid of having their children taken away from them, or even of going to jail. For example, one of the families that I'm in communication with has a trans son who's doing great now, but who originally started on the path of getting gender-affirming care because he had a suicide attempt at 10 years old. And so this is a family in Texas who are constantly wondering, do we need to leave? Are the authorities going to kind of find out that our son, had this care? Can we make it to the end of his senior year in high school? And there's sort of a constant reflection over whether they're safe and whether they need to uproot their lives that's going on, kind of every day.
I'm so moved by that it's so hard to move on from that conversation. So I do want to pick that up, because that is something that's very important to talk about, because there is your right. There's also your right to find joy and not be persecuted every day. I do want to talk about that even further. But first, I do have to bring in Orion, because I want to talk about Transgender Day of Visibility being marked exactly 1 month ago. You covered a rally that took place on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Who was there, and what did you hear from them?
Thanks, Frankie. So the first thing that surprised me about that rally is there were a lot of cisgender people there for a day that's designed to be about like celebrating trans people, especially in a moment where we're being politically attacked. And there are a lot of things people could come out to protest in DC, but they chose to come to this one. There were about 15 members of Congress, all Democrats, who spoke at the rally from different states, a lot of blue states. And they were there the Congress people were there to give a message of, we want to fight for y'all's rights at the federal level. There were a lot of trans speakers there. But when I was in the crowd talking with folks, I spoke with this one woman who's a federal worker, and she's a cis woman. And, she's seen with DOGE dismantling a lot of federal agencies. She's obviously dealt with a lot as a federal employee. But I was struck whenever she told me that her red line of what would actually make her go off as a federal worker is if she was ever told to stop wearing her trans pride pins at work. And I was just like, wow, yeah. There also, I met some college students, some trans college students. There were retirees there, a lot of concerned family members, and a lot of trans people local to DC, which is actually a lot of trans people live in DC. So it was an energized crowd. It was a lot of folks finding a moment of catharsis, I think, right now.
Very important to hear those anecdotes. Trans Visibility Day, created to give trans people a day of joy. Despite the anti-trans legislation we've seen and all this rhetoric, can there still be this joy? And were you able to see this in Washington, D.C.?
Absolutely. That joy was there. And I think I saw it most strongly in these two younger kids, trans college students. They were just holding each other, like wrapped around in a trans pride flag as they watched. And I spoke to them, and they said that something as simple as just being surrounded by other people who care about them, who understand what's going on, because there is so much to keep track of under this second Trump administration. So many ways people are being impacted. There's a sense from some trans people that maybe people aren't aware of what's happening in this community. So people did feel that joy just from the simplicity of being surrounded by people who care, who are aware, who know, how bad the situation is becoming.
Evan, you talked about people potentially leaving the country because of how bad things are. This is something that people are looking for refuge potentially. Are they finding that, and where might they find that outside of the United States? And what do the laws look like in those other places? I would imagine they look very similar to what they are in Connecticut.
Yeah, so considering leaving the country is a very individual choice.
Absolutely.
It's not easy to get residency elsewhere, and so people generally have to take a very individual look at their own circumstances, where they have family, where they have kind of history or ties. Um, and so we do see both a process of people moving from uh, states that are, dominated by the Republican Party and have instituted these kind of oppressive laws, to states like Connecticut, Massachusetts, California, places where protections are, still existing. And also people looking at, could I leave the country? Does it make sense for me? And I think, I'm very much encouraging trans people to think about it, to like have it on their radar if it's possible. I don't think we want people to panic, but I do think that ultimately the federal government has a lot of power, and this federal government is really determined to push the boundaries of what's legal. And we've already seen detentions that most of us would consider unconstitutional and illegal going forward. So it's kind of, without panicking, considering if there is an ability to get to safety and what that would look like individually, is something that I've encouraged people to do and that I've engaged in myself.
There's a report, excuse me. There's a proposed rule dealing with healthcare that I'd like to put some focus on. Orion, this question's for you. You're reporting that this rule from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services could bring costs up for transgender Americans starting in 2026. Can you describe what the rule proposes?
Absolutely. So this is one piece of a very large proposal from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. The entire thing could cause up to 2 million people to lose their healthcare coverage in 2026. For my reporting, because it might be, I focus on what this rule would do for trans Americans. And the agency wants to stop insurance sold on the individual and small group marketplace from including gender-affirming care. And it would cause costs to go up, uh, definitive, like it would definitely cause costs to go up for anyone who gets their healthcare through the marketplace. So affordable care, a marketplace plan, like a plan they get through the Affordable Care Act marketplace. I spoke with experts who there are, so that's a definitive what impact it would have, and there are other impacts it could potentially have. It could also cause costs to go up for trans people who are on employer sponsored healthcare plans. And another potential impact here could be that it causes bad behavior from insurance companies because they're getting a signal from the federal government that we don't want you to be covering gender affirming care for trans people. Um, and the way that this rule talks about gender affirming care, the way that it describes it, could encourage the experts I spoke to said this could encourage health insurance companies to be more dismissive of coverage for trans people overall, even when it's not related to gender affirming care. So there are a lot of possibilities. The base level effect would be higher costs, which is bad for a group that already disproportionately lives in poverty or has low income.
What forms of healthcare would be in jeopardy?
So the rule deals with essential health benefits, and these are the kinds of basic care like hospitalization, mental health services, and prescription drugs that the Affordable Care Act mandates health insurance has to cover these areas. Um, and without getting too deep into the weeds, because it's so much fun to talk about healthcare insurance. This is basic care. And the strange part of this rule is that gender affirming care is a very broad concept, and it's a very broad form of care that encompasses all of these basic care elements that is a has essential health benefit. Like getting gender affirming surgery means hospitalization going on hormones means you get a prescription from the pharmacy. Gender affirming, like, and achieving both of those things means you have to see a mental health provider. So at every step of this gender affirming care we're receiving, we are having to use an essential health benefit. So that's kind of the warning signal that experts are putting up here, that they're trying to, through this rule, they're trying to make gender affirming care more expensive or have it not be covered, when at every step, like, it needs to be covered as basic care.
Just a proposal at this point. Where does it go from here?
Yeah, so the proposal left public comments, I believe, in April. Yeah, it's still April. It left public comments earlier in April, and now the agency has the joy of reading like 25,000 public comments. They do have to look through those, and then it will, yeah, and this is in the Federal Registrar. So like any policy, it usually, like, every step takes like a couple months. So it's gonna be, and the text may change, like you pointed out. It's not a final rule.
Earlier this year, Evan, the Trump administration erased references to transgender people from New York's Stonewall National Monument website. The National Park Service website shortened the acronym LGBTQ plus to LGB, standing for lesbian, gay, and bisexual, right?
That's right. It's a sort of bizarre acronym that doesn't really organically exist in the LGBTQ community, which has been trans inclusive back to its origins, which is often kind of associated with Stonewall, with the Stonewall riot.
So I would imagine that since you're saying that this is not something that has been used in the community, it's something that's being met rather with angst, I would imagine.
Yeah, the erasures of words like trans and transgender, and even the letter T itself from websites overseen by the federal government is sort of part of this larger process of trying to erase trans people from public life, which is something that is very unsettling. The administration wants to impose upon the culture this sort of forgetting, this sort of erasing the memory that trans people were accepted and welcomed and able to participate. And that sort of vast cultural project, I would say, is the type of thing that has been undertaken in some of the worst authoritarian regimes in history. It's associated with some extreme darkness in terms of persecution. But I would say, on the other hand, we have a very open, international community with the internet and sources of information that really couldn't have been even imagined in some of those darker times that I'm sort of referencing. So, so it's sort of yet to be seen if they can reshape the culture in this sort of hateful image, but it's very frightening and unsettling. And, for transgender people, they're trying to tell us that we aren't worthy of respect and dignity like any other American, which is something that you sort of can't not have a response to that.
And just not just trans people, obviously, but you're also having queer and intersex and more in that conversation as well.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the definition of sex as being male and female with nothing in between and no ability to change is sort of biologically incorrect, because we know that there are many intersex conditions that would fall into a sort of gray area or in between. And it's sort of really frightening to see this sort of black is white, 2 + 2 = 5 federal government that wants to sort of impose a cultural narrative on people's, factual reality.
You're a reporter, and they're also making you a biologist nowadays because you have to understand all this and help us unpack it. Orion, you recently spoke to some of the LGBTQ plus elders who experienced the 1969 Stonewall uprising in New York City firsthand. Help us understand more about Stonewall. why it's relevant to this conversation, and what you heard from those folks.
Absolutely. So, I spoke with LGBTQ elders, including Carla J, and she was at the second night of the Stonewall protests. And I was speaking to her and these other LGBTQ elders to just hear from them to give us some perspective on our current moment, because like y'all have been talking about, the Trump administration on day one made it very like they wanted to send a very strong signal on what they believe about trans people, which is pretty unprecedented, like the amount of time they spent on it. But I wanted to speak with these elders to give us some perspective on where has this community been before? Has it been darker? How did y'all get through these hard times? Um, and what Carla told me and what these other elders told me is that they are worried that history will repeat itself. They are worried that LGBTQ people will be put in the dark again by Trump's draconian policies regarding LGBTQ people. Um, but they also said that things are not that bad yet, that it's not as bad as it was before Stonewall yet. And they really want younger LGBTQ people to start taking steps to prioritize their own mental health and their own sanity as they just deal with the realities of life right now, and as they find ways to try and fight back. And they were just sharing different memories from when they were younger. Like Carla said that she was afraid before every protest she went to, including Stonewall. She's afraid of, getting arrested. She was afraid of getting beaten. Like the fear never left her. But what her and these other elders told me is they've had to learn how to manage fear without letting it swallow them. And what that looks like is pretty much just pacing themselves and like finding ways to just uh, fill their own cups, like to remember themselves. And so that was a really helpful conversation for me, and I hope for our readers.
Mental health is so crucial for all of us. Thank you so much for bringing that up, Orion. And earlier, Evan talked about something that somebody was dealing with and now having trouble addressing because of what's happening. I just want to mention before we head to break that if you're in crisis, you're not alone. If you live in Connecticut, there are many suicide prevention resources available. You can call 211 and press 1, or call text 988, or chat by visiting www.988lifeline.org. After the break, we're going to talk quick about passports. If you identify with an X marker, as many non-binary people do, is your passport still valid? Give us a call, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. Back with more in a minute. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. President Trump wants to do away with the option many non-binary Americans use to identify their gender as X on passports. But as it turns out, there are obstacles in the way of doing that. Still with me, Orion Rumler, LGBTQ plus reporter from the 19th, and Evan Urquhart, journalist and founder of Assign Media. Folks, join the conversation. I know a lot of you are just listening by, but you can feel free to call as well. 888-720-9677. We'll work you in really quickly as part of this conversation. Orion, when did an X marker become an option on U.S. passports?
So this became an option. This was something the Biden administration worked to implement during his term. So in 2021, 2022, folks became able to get an X marker on their passport, which, as you mentioned, a lot of non-binary folks want this. But I'll also add that it can also be a helpful gender marker for folks, like for someone who does have a binary gender, but their presentation may confuse border officials. I spoke with a trans man who identifies as a man, but he wanted to get an X marker because no matter what other gender marker he used at the border officials didn't believe him because his gender expression was so ambiguous. So he was like, oh, I'll get an X marker because then they won't be confused. But now he can't do that.
President Trump aiming to block access to the X marker on passports. A federal judge has blocked that effort. Orion, does the federal judge's blocking apply to everyone in the country, or is it only to the plaintiffs involved in the case? Jurisdiction, what are we looking at?
So it's in this ACLU case, it's only the, I believe, 6 plaintiffs who can now access the gender markers they need to access. So it's not a nationwide ruling. The ACLU, of course, is pushing to make that happen.
Does the federal judge's blocking of this rule serve as a glimmer of hope for the transgender community, Evan?
It certainly is a glimmer of hope to see that the federal judiciary is sort of pushing back on these constitutional grounds that ought to protect every American. I do think that the concern is that we have a sort of increasingly radicalized and partisan Supreme Court, and we don't know what's going to happen in terms of protecting our individual rights, particularly as trans people when it gets up there.
What does all this mean in a practical sense for people who already have a valid passport with an X marker, Orion? And what about people who are hoping to apply for a passport with an X marker?
So if you are traveling, if you're a trans person with an X marker on your passport, I would not use that passport when you travel right now. So far, there's one case that I've seen where a trans woman, in this case, a Miss Major, was traveling recently stateside at an airport with an X gender marker, and she was stopped and given a hard time about it. I need to touch base with her to get more details about it. But it's tough because we don't have a lot of clarity, and a lot of times, like, the way you're treated as a trans person when you travel depends on the state you're in, what that TSA officer feels like that day, and how the system in that airport is set up, because it is a very gendered system for how you go through TSA. Like, they check boxes that say male or female. So practically speaking, like, the State Department has said that if you have a passport with an X gender marker on it, like, this is a valid American passport. Like, no one can take it from you because it is a passport. The State Department has asked people to voluntarily send in their X marker passports to get it updated to your birth assigned at sex, but they can't make you do that. But they're not going to issue new X marker passports for folks.
Very important perspective there. Very important reporting that Orion is doing. LGBTQ plus reporter from the 19th. Look forward to a follow-up on that X passport story and all the great work that you were doing, including covering Trans Visibility Day last month. Orion, where can people find you?
At 19thnews.org. Thanks so much, Frankie.
Be sure to go there. We stand the 19th here at Connecticut Public, as my former colleague Meg Dalton used to say. And you've been listening to Evan Urquhart, the journalist and founder of Assigned Media. Evan, really appreciate your insights today. Where can people find you?
That would be assignedmedia.org, Frankie, and also stand the 19th, absolutely.
Yeah, we're going to stand Assigned Media, too, as well. Today's show produced by Chloe Wynn. What a fantastic job she did amid a lot of things going on. Thank you so much, Chloe. Edited by Robin Doyen-Aiken. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Folks, download the Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is the Wheelhouse. Thank you so much for listening.